Welcome to the City of Decatur's Anti-Racism Speaker Series. This is the first of a series of conversations this fall as we work to become an anti-racist city. This is the third year where we're inviting scholars, authors, activists to join us as we cultivate strategies to help us do better as we figure out how we can be better together. This series is hosted by the Better Together Advisory Board in partnership with the Decatur City Commission. At the heart of this series really is a belief that our lives are enriched and enlivened when we dwell in spaces where we can appreciate and learn from the unique experiences of others. While we remain inspired by the transformative opportunities that reside in the humble conversation, this year's speaker series is a little different from the previous installment. It's a bit of an experiment. It's an experiment that's guided by our belief that stories are at the foundation of cultural change. Humans are indeed storytelling creatures. Stories about our shared goals and heritage have served as a galvanizing force for history's most miraculous moments of empowerment and emancipation. Conversely, a different set of stories have sowed seeds for dispossession and displacement. This year's anti-racism speaker series is interested in the hidden stories of struggle, strain, and success that are buried in the annals of racial history. We have a couple of logistical announcements before shifting to the heart of the program. One, we hope that you will submit questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, that is if you're on the laptop, and at the top of your screen if you're on a mobile device. Second, we have turned off the feature that allows us to capture shared images, so you should only see the participants during the webinar. And third, you will receive a short, about 2-minute anonymous survey after the program that will inform future events. While it has been truly a distinct honor and pleasure for me to facilitate the previous events, I am particularly excited about this evening's engagement. Our first presenter for this year is Dr. Anjulet Tucker, a cultural sociologist and director of presidential initiatives at Emory University. Dr. Tucker is one of the primary leaders in the university's effort to create a twin memorials on Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses that will serve as a nexus point for the university's ongoing efforts to tend to its history of slavery and dispossession. I consider Dr. Tucker a friend and a thought partner who I never pass up the opportunity to learn from. We are so fortunate that she is willing to share her brilliance with us, and we are definitely honored that she decided to digitally hang out with us this weekend or this evening. The floor is yours, Dr. Tucker, and I look forward for the back and forth of our conversation.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And I never pass up an opportunity to spend some time with you, Ed, to talk about, we talk about these things all the time informally. And this is such a sort of wonderful format to really bring those conversations to light in light of the series. I think it makes sense to begin by talking about why Emory is embarking on this project and why now. And so it's not the complete and comprehensive history, but these are sort of some key milestones in how we got here. In short, Emory is building memorials on its Oxford and Atlanta campuses to honor the lives and legacies of the enslaved laborers who are part of its history. And so how do we get here? Do y'all remember the summer of 2020? How tumultuous that time was for our nation and for our campus, and quite frankly, many campuses, many organizations grappling with all that was sort of tilled as a result of that summer. Yeah, so Emory was in the middle of that, and we were actually in the middle of selecting a new president. And so our current president, Greg Fembish, joins Emory while there are a set of requests from students, demands, some might call them, on his desk already. Part of those demands were asking, what is the institution doing formally to help us students remember its role in disenfranchising populations? You know, how do we find a mechanism so we don't have to sort of uncover this every year as if it's like unknown to us? And so they were asking these questions in many different ways, but that's essentially the question we're looking at. Have we reckoned with our history? They knew that we'd done some things, but how do we keep remembering that we're reckoning with this on an ongoing basis? So those were some of the questions that were on the table. And so in response, the institution convened several groups over the course of time. But for this conversation, I'll focus on one of them was called, and I love their name, the Task Force on Untold Stories and Disenfranchised Populations. And that group, which the president actually reconvened, they had been doing some work in a previous administration, but he expanded it and added some students to that group and gave them a sort of focused charge. And part of their recommendations included really pursuing this idea of twin memorials. Let me say a word about twin. That doesn't mean identical memorials, but they were saying there needs to be memorials on both of our campuses, our original campus, which was built in 1836, and the Atlanta campus, to be in dialogue with each other about all of the sort of intersection of those campuses and how they sort of entwined around slavery. And so the Twin Memorial, the task force made a set of recommendations, and out of that came a working group, and they spent a year in the communities in Oxford, in Covington, and in Atlanta, on our campuses and off our campuses, talking to community members, asking, what are your thoughts and insights about this project? So that's how we got here. But of course, the notion that there should be memorials or some acknowledgement of the legacies of enslaved laborers did not start with this recent task force and groups. That idea had been knocked about informally for at least 20 years from what I've been able to sort of trace back. And so, actually in 2011, the institution issued a statement of regret for its entanglement in slavery. Etta, I don't know if you've been at Emory for a long time, so I don't know if you remember that. But that came on the heels of this massive multi-year transforming community project where community members of all levels at the university were in dialogue about sort of interrogating the institution's narrative, its identity, and what that meant for everybody who worked or interacted with it. So the 2011 statement of regret was sort of really a result of that work. In 2011, we also hosted a conference on slavery in the university. I say we, but let me say Leslie Harris. There's so many names, and I wish I had all the full roster of names of individuals that brought the institution to this point, who have been asking and pushing and asking these questions for a long time. I don't have them all, but I will offer Leslie Harris's, because her work really just really set the foundation for what we're doing today. And so Ruth Simmons, the president of Brown, keynoted that sort of milestone conference. And at the time, she was doing this really groundbreaking work at Brown. They had one of the earliest schools who actually had a memorial on their campus in that early period. And so 10 years later, in 2021, after these students, these same students that I was telling you about who brought these concerns to the administration, we hosted another conference on slavery and dispossession about 10 years after that work that Leslie had done, bringing it together another set of community members to talking about these issues. So where are we now? After that period of listening, most recently, the institution selected a design firm, selected this firm, Hood Design Studio. We've been working on that this summer to lead the design process. Walter Hood is the lead artist. Walter Hood is a professor at UC Berkeley. And if you haven't had a chance to see the museum in Charleston, the International Museum of African American History, I haven't seen it yet. I can't wait to get there. Walter did the landscaping design for that work. I'm told that it is quite powerful, impactful. And so we are really excited to be in dialogue with him as he takes our communities again through this process to really understand what are these stories that y'all are talking about, and how can we, going back to what the students were asking for, make that a part of the landscape of these campuses, so we never forget, and we sort of provoke those conversations that the students wanted to make sure we're on this institution's radar back in the summer of 2020. So that's where we are. So I hope that that's enough to start a conversation, but I thought it might be useful for you all to sort of hear how we got here.
Now, so one of the roles that you play at Emory is that you're one of the institution's culture keepers. You're one of those folk who is an alum. You're back. You understand the trajectory. You understand its history. And you're right. I've had sort of the opportunity to talk with you about a lot of different projects that you work on, but there's a different energy. There's a different vibe in the way in which you talk about this particular work. I'm curious, why are you personally interested in the Twin Memorial Project and this notion of untold stories?
Ed, I don't know if anybody's really asked me that question. So I'm glad that you have. For me, thinking about the things that make me come alive over the course of my career, and also as a student, I realized I like chasing undertold. I don't like to call them untold. Somebody was telling them I have to say undertold, undertold stories. And there are sort of many examples of ways that have sort of been intrigued by something that not everybody's talking about, but catches my attention. And I need to go down those corridors and those rabbit holes. And in this case, what is so compelling to me about this project is the doors it opens up to learning about who these enslaved laborers were, what they were doing, how their descendants carry forward their legacies and have been telling their stories. Quite frankly, Ed, not everybody's always listening. They've been telling their stories, and so the opportunity to illumine those storytellers, those narrators who have been keeping these stories alive, is really just, I don't know words can't really express how gratifying that is to me. I will name one of them, who I'm just so fortunate to begin to build a relationship. I had heard about her for a long time, but finally this project put us into close proximity with each other. Reverend Dr. Avis Williams. She's a descendant herself, four-time Emory alum, and a community organizer, so many things. Avis has plays so many roles, but the way that she has sort of galvanized the descendant community, keeps them informed about what we're working on, shares their insights throughout this planning process. her hopes, her dreams, being a voice for that community has been really a gratifying relationship. And along the way, we're meeting many, many more voices that we can't wait to sort of also illumine throughout the process, throughout this process. So for me, it's really about, to answer your question more directly, it is about I'm drawn to this opportunity to give platform and
Yeah.
voice and light to these underrepresented conversations that have been happening. I don't like untold stories because they're being
Yeah.
told. They're told around the dining room table. Sometimes they're told in the books that we have. People don't read those books all the time
Yeah.
carefully. I mean, I
Yeah.
went, as you mentioned, and I went here as an undergrad. I went here. I did graduate work in Laney Graduate School, and it wasn't on my radar. But that doesn't mean that they were not written already in some of our official histories. How do you get that history out of that book and into a place where it is embodied, where people know these things? That is also part of why this project I find so compelling.
Yeah, you got me thinking. I think a lot about communication, and I tend to think about it from the perspective of the reader, the speaker, adapting to the audience and the need of the audience. And what you got me thinking about here is really the role and importance of the audience adapting to these undertold stories, and how do they respond to them. How do you think that we can be good audiences in
Hmm.
terms of our relationship to undertold stories? Are there a set of objectives that we should take on? Is there a set of responsibilities for seeking these out? What are you thinking about as an audience, who is as a listener, one who needs to try to appreciate these and use them to make our communities better? How do we be a better audience?
You know, to be a good audience, you have to be a good listener, but also interrogate your own immediate assumptions about what you're hearing. I'll frame this with a story. I remember in graduate school, I wrote. I also did work on undertold sort of populations. I was writing about Black Pentecostals at the time. There was a lot of stuff in the libraries. I remember writing this paper about the literature section, and this is underrepresented, and this is why I need to say this. And the professor wrote back, well, actually, you haven't read this, this, and that. Be
Mm,
careful before you say, this is not in the literature. Do a little bit more homework, basically, is what he was saying. Right? Yes, you're right. Overall, it's undertold. But what you're talking about, somebody did say that. And just because you haven't read it doesn't mean somebody didn't say it. And so I remember that putting the kind of responsibility back on me. Hey, have I read those histories that are already out there? Have I sought them out? And I think as audience members, as we can really sort of ask those questions for ourselves before we say the institution has never acknowledged this. Wait, hold on. Now that means the organizations, the responsibility on organizations, these universities, to put that information out there in a clear and concise way is certainly there. So they can't be buried. They can't be buried so far where it takes, you have to take a week off from work to find what's going on out there. But I do think there are ways that we can make that accessible. And I'm also a big fan of the libraries. So I do a lot of promotion for the libraries. Probably should have been a librarian in my other past life, but I do think that that is the sort of heart and soul work of the libraries, is also be the keeper of these what we've done already, and making that accessible. So when a new student joins and say, I think I've heard something about this, easily being able to go to these institutional resources and getting that information. And that's kind of what the students were saying in 2020. Hey, we can't necessarily navigate. It's here, we know, but help us navigate that a little bit more so that we have the tools as good students to ask the right questions.
yeah, it's clear how better listening, a strategy of memorialization on both of the campuses, can really serve as an act of remembrance, of honoring. What are ways in which it contributes to a process of reconciliation or even repair? How do you see a connection between that work of listening to undertold stories in producing opportunities for reconciliation and repair?
You know, that word reconciliation, that word repair, I have, and I don't know, this has happened in the last few years. Maybe for me, this is the impact of 2020 on me personally. Um, I have deep respect for that process.
Mm.
And for me, it doesn't come overnight, and it's not a sort of I encounter this, therefore I am ready for repair. What that takes to sort of sit in the moment where that emerges organically, and with the structures in place, I have deep respect for that process. So I think the memorials for some, because people come to this at so many different phases. Some people, the first encounter, some people, this is the culmination of 25 years of work, all how they're interacting with that and how that inspires this repair and reconciliation will look very different. So I think that what I'm trying to get at in terms of the sort of patience for what that looks like in a way that's like palpable, or you see some kind of synergy. I think those of you, people like you who lead that work, need to be really sort of paying attention to those contours and how do we sort of create that space, because recognizing everybody's not going to be at various stages of repair and reconciliation, even with the sort of things like memorials to help spark that process. So yeah, it takes a little time.
Yeah, I'm curious about what does the receptacle for these stories look like?
Mm-hmm.
How, in even thinking about Dr. Davis Williams and creating space, how do we archive this? How do you create opportunities for descendants to speak, engage in a way that allows for the truest sense of their needs to be at the center of the conversation instead of it being really a vehicle for someone else to
Mm-hmm.
move their agenda forward? How do we make sure that it is the end and not a means? How do we archive the stories? And how do we make sure that as we're doing that process, it's not to the benefit of someone else, but to the agenda of those who are most impacted?
Ed, one of the things that is a really interesting development of other institutions engaged in this work at this moment is that this question is central for so many of them. There's a group called the University Studying Slavery Consortium. Emory joined that group in 2021. Actually, Leslie Harris, the professor I was talking about earlier, she was instrumental in its founding. And we have about a dozen or so schools that are engaged in memorialization work. And the last conference, which was at UNC Chapel Hill, the focus and theme of that conversation was listening to descendant voices. Mm-hmm. And people are really, really interested in the best practices around that, learning from one another, what to do, what didn't work. One of the funniest things that happened, he rarely use that word funny at a sort of academic like conference, but these descendants put on a skit for us university folks to model how not to do work with the I said that, and the message is well received. We all clutch the pearls like, oh, have we all been guilty of this? And so that work is ongoing. There are no easy answers except to say, keep asking the questions, checking ourselves and keeping those dialogues along. But even in that realm, you run the risk of sort of, okay, now we've gone to this conference and we got it all under control. We're going to build this out, check mark. So there's a dose of humility in there too, about learning and continuing to learn what that means to be in sort of in that humble space, and so that's that part. But in terms of archiving, we do have and this is the previous director of the library is really a visionary for this, that is carried forward by our current vice provost for the libraries and museum, Belita Dent. We have a oral history project
Mm-hmm.
for descendants, and they have been depositing their stories. Now, let me just, what I love about this project, it's not this race to the finish. It's sort of taking time as descendants are ready. Those who are willing to tell their stories, we're asking them to deposit them in our libraries so that we can have them for generations of students. But some descendants have deposited oral histories and deciding, well, I don't necessarily want this for public consumption, but I want to be able to sort of record my story, and honoring that as well. People's willingness and readiness to sort of be on that platform looks very different too.
Mm-hmm.
Descendants are not a monolith as well. Some are saying, listen, good for you, I'll leave me out of it. and others wanting to be at that table. So that's the sort of constant checking in, Ed, that I think is so critical for anybody who plays any role in these kinds of projects, to keep asking the question and never get to a place where you're finished. You're finished learning that part. Check mark. Let's move on to the next phase.
I'm one of the things that's coming to my mind is that I know that there are various corridors of our society, and maybe even some folks who we hang out with on Emory's campus who would say something like, "Look, we know this history. We have a litany of history books that have been written. We have a history department with people who study this. We have a bunch of students taking classes. We even have an African American Studies department that just stood up a PhD program. Why do we need these kinds of efforts? They really feel redundant and unnecessary at this moment. What would you say to a
Mm-hmm.
person who forwarded that argument to you?
You know, in all the listening sessions we had, we didn't hear that, but we also knew that some people were still asking that question, even though they may not have voiced it in the comments and things at these sessions that we had. You know, what I would say is, well, if we're listening to the students who really initiated this conversation, the more recent version of this conversation in 2020, they were saying, we don't all know this history.
Mm, mm,
It's out there, but we don't all know it. And so part of this is making this work sort of common knowledge, right? It's sort of like, you know, they talk about somebody might have whispered it and they heard it and then they had to go do some work, but it's not something that is known to everyone else up front, not just for students, new community members who join the university, new faculty members, new staff members. They don't all know it and are not sort of compelled to learn it. So that's part of it. Yes, of course, history departments and our sociology departments, and these are places where students are going to sort of drink from this fountain of knowledge to sort of understand the tools to work through these kinds of histories, but they are still interior. And I think the symbolism of the institution itself having taking steps towards acknowledgement, owning and talking about reckoning and grappling with that looks very different from that conversation happening in the interior classroom on a particular
mm-hmm.
campus. And so this conversation we're having here in the city of Decatur, externally focused conversations about an organization sort of saying, as an institution, we need to work on these things, really means something different symbolically. And I do think those symbolic gestures are really important to signal to others also that this is
Yeah.
something that is worthy to do. So I think not discounting the work that happens, that's essential work, because those are the sort of cultural keepers and knowledge keeper workers of our in the academy and beyond. You need to do that work in the classroom, but also doing that work as an institution means a lot for more than just the students who sign up for those courses.
Yeah, your response got me thinking about how my straw person argument really does assume that there's a cemented reality, a
Mm-hmm.
truth that we have accepted, and that all we have to do is look at a state a little down from where we are, where the battles of truth around the history of Black folks is still up for grabs, and that there's a need for a constant reciting, retrofitting, or as some people would say, come to Jesus moment and truth telling. Are there practices in your thinking about this work of how one should go about constantly reiterating the truth? Constantly, are there best practices as we think about creating space for these kinds of stories and narratives in the city of Decatur that can be followed to make sure that when some people come along and try to chisel away or retrofit and refine what that reality is, that we're in a better place of dealing with that?
Yeah, I think memorialization is part of that work because they are encounters. They force an encounter with the particular reality. And so that's why there's a whole sort of national conversation going about memorials and monuments that the Mellon Foundation is leading. It's just really fascinating. People feel all type of ways about that. But at the end of the day, that's to me their fundamental function, is to force an encounter with a particular reality, with a particular kind of or sort of context. So that's part of it. But I also believe, the rituals of gathering community that we create together, where we are sort of retelling those stories in public formats are really important. So where are the places where they can be embedded in community gatherings? Where are the places where they can be marked? I'm going to sort of go back to the libraries again, because here's the critique. I already can hear the sort of alternative. Well, there's still sort of repeating of a particular narrative, what makes it true. And this is why the libraries do such an essential, important work. The library actually there's a graduate student who's working with us alongside us on this project. Making sure our archival records support the public tellings of what we're saying. So what do you do with this property receipt with these names listed? These are legally binding documents. And so that work there takes it out of, well, this is Anjulet's interpretation of what might have happened. No. As the young people say, we got receipts, the literal receipts. And so those are some of the things that I think to sort of counter those other the narratives of things did not happen, really leaning on those kinds of organizations that are like, actually, this is the evidence that it did, is going to be part of our future. It's going to be.
Finish your thought.
I was just going to say, it's just has to be part of our future.
So as you're speaking, and we got receipts, I can imagine where many of those receipts of purchasing people who look like us are housed, and they're not housed in homes that are owned by people who look like us. And in some ways, I'm wondering about, in corollary, who gets to frame the stories that I can see good folk who have ancestors who engaged in nefarious deeds being very interested in participating in an effort of reclamation of their own heritage by engaging in a type of work of acknowledging but controlling the stories. How do we make sure that those sort of banal forms of domination, where it serves to legitimize a particular community, a particular culture, that's not those who are the most marginalized and those who are the most need of having space created where their ideas, their thoughts, their understandings of the world can stand in to speak for who they are and what their needs are?
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that question. You asked some hard questions today, Ed. There's no easy one size fits all answer to that question. But I will say this: let me start with this records piece. I'm obsessed with this because I just really have seen one of these conferences I went to, there was this really fascinating panel where they were talking about how to create, for years, the institution had been talking about how to create this conversation between descendants of enslavers and enslaved, and it was complicated, and they had records that the institution didn't have, and what does that look like? But then there were some leaders like you, who were creating space on those campuses to say, let's have this conversation, and it's going to be in a space where all voices can be heard. And once that ground was tilled, I'll get to the punchline here, that institution was able, someone donated full family records that answered questions that the descendants had for years. So there's possibility in that. That's that we were talking about reclamation and repair a few questions ago. That's one example of how that can look when the space is created for that kind of exchange. But that didn't happen overnight, and it took sort of building blocks towards that, right? So that's one way to do it. Really, just the folks who are space creators. I don't know what it's a new name for that. Folks who create those environments are so essential, because if you start with everybody out here, we can only have this conversation here, you can't get to a moment like that. And so now they're sort of have ongoing dialogues, and they're, and that work itself is now on a new journey to where it is. But I do think this intentionality about dominance and how one can assert one's own ego, one's own research agenda, into these things, one's own family history into these things, and obscure folks who these projects are intended to illumine is a real danger. And I do think being in community with those who hold us accountable, who raise the questions, who embrace humility, is one way to sort of be on guard for that, because that's a real risk.
Yeah, you've done a lot of reading and travel and been in conversations with folks who try to be intentional in the way that you've talked about in centering previously marginalized voices. I'm curious, what are some examples that start to bubble up of other places that you think, okay, you got this piece right, and that I would like to use this as my TLIS that guides how I would like for us to do this work?
I'm really excited by what's happening at Johns Hopkins. I don't know if you know about their recent journey, but Johns Hopkins is frequently talked about as an abolitionist. And then they discovered some records, some receipts that may show some census records that he may have owned enslaved individuals. And so the institution really had to really think about, it's kind of reorienting its narrative around what that means. All right, it's to claim a whole new different sort of way of talking about it as heritage. And so their project involves a partnership with the libraries and communications, and it's about, yes, illuminating the life of Johns Hopkins, but the spillover is to the point in the sort of theme of this series, invites community members to share their own narratives as part of their larger project to really have more materials to tell more stories about. So it extends beyond just the sort of question about slavery and their owner, but really to a community project. How can we all be collectors? How can we all make sure the gaps that are in these archives are filled by stuff we have in our own home? So there are calls for on there. If you are a student organization and you were here during this time and we don't know anything about you, please call us so we can sort of make sure you're accounted for. I really like that aspect of it, because it really turned us, turns us all into actors that have a role to play, especially with marginalized groups whose records are not always sort of kept or deposited. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited about what's happening at Harvard who's recently, released a sort of report on their ties to slavery that came with a kind of very generous fund, and been in conversation with my colleagues there who have the daunting task of how to disseminate that work in a way that centers the sort of voices that need to be illumined. And so that work is really exciting. And also the Georgetown work that's most interesting to me is not actually what the institution has been working on. They're grappling with the 272 slaves that sort of were essential to the founding of Georgetown. But I'm interested in all the community members outside of Georgetown who are inspired by that story. If you haven't read, I'm going to get her last name wrong, Rachel Swarms, I believe it is, new book, The 272. I inhaled it in 2 days. I mean, what it does is sort of bring those narratives, thinking about 272, that sounds so abstract. There's a number of, enslaved people that the institution sold. Instead of sort of grappling with that as an abstract, he teases out the stories of a few of them. And it sort of makes, it humanizes that number, and really takes you on a journey of what that looks like. And so it's a really powerful book. So there's really interesting things going on around the nation and among our peers. I think what Emory is going to have to do is find out what that means, in our context. What does it mean to have a memorial that is well done, right? And deciding what that criteria will be, will also have to be criteria that centers descendant sort of voices, and marginalized people. So, for example, if from an art history perspective, it's a stunning rendering, so whatever that is, if the families of descendants come to it and they don't see their relatives' lives reflected in it, if the students who are marginalized, who feel most connected to that, don't see themselves reflect, it's not successful. So those are the questions that we're really going to have to grapple with when we evaluate what's well done.
Yeah. It seems that the best version of these kinds of projects will do what Rachel Swarm's 272 book did for you. It enlivens, it humanizes people who went through these traumas and tragedies, but it also shines a light on a more contemporary set of actors that allows for those folks to be humanized as well. And I'm interested in you dreaming with me a little bit.
Okay.
Let's say we're a decade from now. How how would you hope that this effort has reshaped conversation, the contours of the campus and who shows up, those who are welcomed, the types of conversations that may be happening outside of the classroom, in the classroom, within the larger community? What's the impact that you want?
Oh boy, that's a good one. Well, I will say this: we're having this conversation not on Emory's campus. We're having this in a virtual format, that the City of Decatur is hosting, and one of the impacts is, I hope, that our neighbors and visitors and folks that surround these campuses feel welcome and compelled and drawn to visit these memorials and spark their own conversations and dialogue. So it's not just an interior conversation for Emory, because this issue, this topic, these set of concerns are not interior or specific to Emory. They're national problems, they're organizational problems, they're institutional problems that all of us in one way or another have a relationship to. And so I do hope that our campus becomes a destination point for people to learn and encounter. That's part of it. Of course, our students and faculty members in interior and community interior to the organizations on both campuses, I hope that they too will use these encounters to ask new questions, to go down their own rabbit holes, to challenge what they have read, to to go to the libraries and do their own research and make an appointment with archivists to see what we've got on this topic and others. I hope the Atlanta campus students get on the shuttle and go to Oxford to spend some time with the memorial on that campus. And our original campus, which has a whole sort of unique culture, and vice versa, that Oxford students feel compelled to go to the Atlanta campus so that they feel that the memorial on the campus is in dialogue with what is on their campus. So lots of outcomes, but those are some more immediate ones. It's really about I envision, I'm a visual person, people sitting with, asking, spark, watching them spark that conversation sort of in contemplation, sort of bubble up in their minds, and using those conversations to take action in one way or another, whether that means with the pen or having a conversation at the dinner table that they hadn't had before.
Yeah. Yeah. I was having a conversation with one of our colleagues over in the Rollins School earlier today, and we were talking about just salient identities. And I mentioned how oftentimes one of the salient identities that I have is being a Southerner, where I use y'all and I eat grits. And there's something about being in the South that's a major part of my identity and who I am. And I'm curious that you mentioned this effort, some of those that you highlighted, Harvard, Brown, that they are Northern institutions. Is there something about Emory being in the South, in the heart of Atlanta, the heart of the civil rights movement, that makes this uniquely different from some of the efforts that they engaged in?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think our northern schools in many ways are sort of following our lead. We were sort of in the game quite early. I joke with my colleague at Harvard, good for you all, but we were here about 20 years ago asking the question that you all are now trying to work through. As the terrain in the South, walking the grounds where a lot of the sort of trauma occurred, really does feel different. And now, don't get me wrong, what our northern schools are grappling with is, wait, hold on, we thought that was a Southern thing. That might be up here too. And we were pointing fingers, and now we have to point the fingers ourselves. So they're having a different kind of conversation. But most of the nation has framed this as sort of like, that's the Southerners' problem, and they've got their stuff. So the folks who are doing this work in these Southern spaces really trying to sort of not just intellectually have this conversation, but realize when you look around at the street names and the sort of grounds we walk on or drive on, how they are also shaped by these histories is part of what it means to sort of do this work in a kind of Southern setting. I do think also, let me just say this, we have to be on guard for those Southern schools that are sort of having this conversation, to be careful that they're not having the conversation solely for the purpose of signaling to others, hey, we are progressive, and we're not like the other, those other folks. We've arrived. That's another thing. We have to be really careful about messaging. That's our past. That has nothing to do with now. We have to be really careful about that. And so that is another, the coolest part about these conferences are the conversations that are having in the hallways, where folks are saying, we got to be careful together about what we're doing, because if those folks who are looking for authenticity will see straight through that, right? So, anywho, my 2 cents there.
Yeah. I think one more question. One of the origins of this, along with some of the work that you did, it was really in response to the events of 2020 and George Floyd, and thus trying to figure out, how do we think about policies, practices, and procedures within our little square of the universe in order to make sure that we're doing right by the people who live here, and can we serve as a demonstration model in some ways of what an anti-racist city can look like. And that's not saying that we are there, but
Mm-hmm.
how are we struggling to try to get there? How can we use that notion as the North Star of our work? And we are also trying to figure out some strategies of highlighting the undertold stories. And so we're curious, what have been some challenges that you have had, that we have had on our campus that we can learn from?
How much time do we have? No, seriously. What are some of the challenges that we have encountered? You mean specifically with the memorials projects,
Yes,
or?
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, everybody is not going to be on board with the mechanism you choose to do the work that you're trying to do. Memorials are not a universally accepted thing. Everybody's not into them. This is the mechanism, one of the mechanisms, and that's the other thing too. This is not the only mechanism. This is one of the mechanisms that the institution is undertaking to sort of grapple with that history. And so I think some of the challenges is putting a lot of eggs in one basket, expecting a lot from expecting everything to occur from sort of immediately or quickly, and not leaving, I think, enough space for breathing room and for folks to really sit with um, um, these sort of heavy weighted topics. I think that those are some of the challenges, because you can be um, efficient, and sometimes you be too efficient and not leave that breathing room, and then that creates
Yeah.
a whole other problem. So I think some of the challenges here are moving and making momentum, but also along the way leaving space and breathing room. That's the balance that I think the challenge, especially with a large enterprise, as we are working through two campuses, right? Um, Different locales, different units, as you know, at departments, all these, they have different cultures. And so if you treat it as a sort of monolith, one solution, one size fits all, everybody get on board here, some of those nuances are lost, and you end up having to do some difficult work on the other end. I'm just learning how to take my time, but not too much time. If you take too much time, people say, you got to start all over again. Take your time, but not too much time. That's how I would summarize that.
Yep. This has been amazing. On behalf of my city, City of Decatur, and the Better Together Advisory Board that's actively working to figure out how to make sure that it's a city that's welcoming, inclusive, engaging, and creating space for all different types of voices, regardless of whether you own the microphone or not. That you get to speak, you get to show up, and you get to show out. I am thankful for what you have offered us. That I have the honor of being able to talk with you on a consistent basis. And I think that the folks could come to realize that this is why I will drop everything that I am doing at that moment and come and figure out how to hang out with you, because every time I leave the conversation energized, enlightened, and ready to get to work. So I
Likewise,
appreciate you, my friend.
and I appreciate y'all. And as a former resident of the city of Decatur, I'm really excited about what y'all are leading on the east side.
All right, Decatur. We'll see you later.
Bye.